different from that of the Chinese emperors. Imagine. You live in Kalinga, and your parents have suffered in the war. Messengers from Ashoka have just arrived with the new ideas about Dhamma. Describe the dialogue between them and your parents. Some important dates. Beginning of the Mauryan Empire, more than 2,300 years ago. Tribute. Unlike taxes, which were collected on a regular basis, tribute was collected as and when it was possible from people who gave a variety of things, more or less willingly. The emperor and the capital city. Megasthenes was an ambassador who was sent to the court of Chandragupta by the Greek ruler of West Asia named Seleucus Nicator. Megasthenes wrote an account about what he saw. Here is a part of his description. The occasions on which the emperor appears in public are celebrated with grand royal processions. He is carried in a golden palanquin. His guards ride elephants decorated with gold and silver. Some of the guards carry trees on which live birds, including a flock of trained parrots, circle about the head of the emperor. The king is normally surrounded by armed women. He is afraid that someone may try to kill him. He has special servants to taste the food before he eats. He never sleeps in the same bedroom for 2 nights. And about Pataliputra, modern Patna, he wrote. This is a large and beautiful city. It is surrounded by a massive wall. It has 570 towers and 64 gates. The houses, of 2 and 3 stories, are built of wood and mud brick. The king's palace is also of wood, and decorated with stone carvings. It is surrounded with gardens and enclosures for keeping birds. Why do you think the king had special servants to taste the food he ate? In what ways was Pataliputra different from Mohenjo-daro? Ashoka's messages to his subjects. People perform a variety of rituals when they fall ill, when their children get married, when children are born, or when they go on a journey. These rituals are not useful. If instead, people observe other practices, this would be more fruitful. What are these other practices? These are, being gentle with slaves and servants, respecting one's elders, treating all creatures with compassion, giving gifts to Brahmins and monks. It is both wrong to praise one's own religion or criticize another's. Each one should respect the other's religion. If one praises one's own religion while criticizing another's, one is actually doing greater harm to one's own religion. Therefore, one should try to understand the main ideas of another's religion, and respect it. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, wrote, his edicts, instructions, still speak to us in a language we can understand and we can still learn much from them. Identify the parts of Ashoka's message that you think are relevant today. Looking ahead. The Mauryan Empire collapsed about 2,200 years ago. In its place, and elsewhere, rose several new kingdoms. In the northwest, and in parts of North India, kings known as the Indo-Greeks ruled for about 100 years. They were followed by a Central Asian people known as the Shakas, who set up kingdoms in the northwest, north and western India. Some of these kingdoms lasted for about 500 years, till the Shakas were defeated by the Gupta kings. The Shakas in turn were followed by the Kushanas, about 2,000 years ago. You will learn more about the Kushanas in Chapter 10. In the north, and in parts of central India, a general of the Mauryas, named Pushyamitra Shunga, set up a kingdom. They Shungas were followed by another dynasty, known as the Kanvas, and by rulers from other families till the establishment of the Gupta Empire about 1,700 years ago. The Shakas who ruled over parts of western India fought several battles with the Satavahanas, who ruled over western and parts of central India. The Satavahana kingdom, which was established about 2,100 years ago, lasted for about 400 years. Around 1,700 years ago, a new ruling family, known as the Vakatakas, became powerful in central and western India. In South India, the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas ruled between 2,200 and 1,800 years ago. And, about 1,500 years ago, there were 2 large kingdoms, those of the Pallavas and the Chalukyas. There were several other kingdoms and kings as well. We know about them from their coins and inscriptions, as well as from books. There were other changes that were taking place, in which ordinary men and women played a major role. These included the spread of agriculture and the growth of new towns, craft productive trade. Raiders explored land routes within the subcontinent and outside, and sea. And outs to West Asia, East Africa and Southeast Asia were also opened up. And many new buildings were built, including the earliest temples and stupas, books were written, and scientific discoveries were made. These developments took place simultaneously, i.e., at the same time. Keep this in mind as you read the rest of the book. Chapter 9. Vital Villages, Thriving Towns. Prabhakar at the blacksmith's shop. Prabhakar sat watching the smiths at the local shop. There was a small bench on which iron tools like axes and sickles were laid out, ready for sale. A bright fire was burning, and two men were heating and beating metal rods into shape. It was very hot and noisy, and yet it was fascinating to watch what was happening. Iron tools and agriculture. We often take the use of iron for granted today. Things made of iron and steel are a part of our daily lives. The use of iron began in the subcontinent around 3,000 years ago. Some of the largest collections of iron tools and weapons were found in the megalithic burials, about which you read in Chapter 5. Around 2,500 years ago, there is evidence for the growing use of iron tools. These included axes for clearing forests, and the iron plowshare. As we had seen, the plowshare was useful for increasing agricultural production. Other steps to increase production: irrigation. The kings and kingdoms you have been reading about could not have existed without the support of flourishing villages. While new tools and the system of transplantation increased production, irrigation was also used. Irrigation works that were built during this time included canals, wells, tanks, and artificial lakes. If you look at the chart, you will find that some of the stages in the construction of irrigation works are mentioned. Fill in the rest by using the following phrases. Labor is provided by the people. Farmers also benefit because crop production is more certain. Farmers have to increase production to pay taxes. Kings provide money and plan irrigation works. Who lived in the villages? There were at least 3 different kinds of people living in most villages in the southern and northern parts of the subcontinent. In the Tamil region, large landowners were known as Vellalar, ordinary ploughmen were known as Uzavar, and including slaves, were known as Kadazayar and Adamai. Landless laborers. In the northern part of the country, the village headman was known as the Grama Pojaka. Usually, men from the same family held the position for generations. In other words, the post was hereditary. The Grama Pojaka was often the largest landowner. Generally, he had slaves and hired workers to cultivate the land. Besides, as he was powerful, the king often used him to collect taxes from the village. He also functioned as a judge, and sometimes as a policeman. Apart from the Grama Pojaka, there were other independent farmers, known as Grihapatis, most of whom were smaller landowners. And then there were men and women such as the Dasa Karmakara, who did not own land, and had to earn a living working on the fields owned by others. In most villages there were also some craftspersons such as the blacksmith, potter, carpenter, and weaver. Finding out about cities, stories, travelers, sculpture, and archaeology. You may have heard of the Jatakas. These were stories that were probably composed by ordinary people, and then written down and preserved by Buddhist monks. Here is part of a Jataka story, which tells us how a poor man gradually became rich. We can use other kinds of evidence to find out about life in some of these early cities. Sculptors carved scenes depicting people's lives in towns and villages, as well as in the forest. Many of these sculptures were used to decorate railings, pillars, and gateways of buildings that were visited by people. Many of the cities that developed from about 2,500 years ago were capitals of the Mahajanapadas that you learnt about in Chapter 6. As we had seen, some of these cities were surrounded by massive fortification walls. In many cities, archaeologists have found rows of pots, or ceramic rings arranged one on top of the other. These are known as ring wells. These seem to have been used as toilets in some cases, and as drains and garbage dumps. These ring wells are usually found in individual houses. We have hardly any remains of palaces, markets, or of homes. Perhaps some are yet to be discovered by archaeologists. Others, brick and thatch, may not have survived. Of ordinary people. Made of wood, mud. Another way of finding out about early cities is from the accounts of sailors and travelers who visited them. One of the most detailed accounts that has been found was by an unknown Greek sailor. He described all the ports he visited. Find Baruch on map 7 and then read his description of the city. Coins. You may have noticed how wealth is measured in terms of coins in the story on page 90. Archaeologists have found several thousands of coins belonging to this period. The earliest coins which were in use for about 500 years were punch-marked coins, such as the one shown below. They have been given this name because the designs were punched onto the metal silver or copper. Cities with many functions. Very often, a single town example of Mathura was important for a variety of reasons. Let us look at the Mathura has been an important settlement for more than 2,500 years. It was important because it was located at the crossroads of two major routes of travel and trade from the northwest to the east and from north to south. There were fortifications around the city, and several shrines. Farmers and herders from adjoining areas provided food for people in the city. Mathura was also a center where some extremely fine sculpture was produced. Around 2,000 years ago Mathura became the second capital of the Kushanas, about whom you will be reading in Chapter 10. Mathura was also a religious center. There were Buddhist monasteries, Jaina shrines, and it was an important center for the worship of Krishna. Several inscriptions on surfaces such as stone slabs and statues have been found in Mathura. Generally, these are short inscriptions, recording gifts made by men, and sometimes women, to monasteries and shrines. These were made by kings and queens, officers, merchants, and craftspersons who lived in the city. For instance, inscriptions from Mathura mention goldsmiths, blacksmiths, weavers, basket makers, garland makers, perfumers. Make a list of the occupations of people who lived in Mathura. List one occupation that was not practiced in Harappan cities. Crafts and craftspersons. We also have archaeological evidence for crafts. These include extremely fine pottery, known as the northern black polished ware. It gets its name from the fact that it is generally found in the northern part of the subcontinent. It is usually black in color, and has a fine sheen. Remember that the archaeological evidence for many crafts may not have survived. We know from texts that the manufacture of cloth was important. There were famous centers such as Varanasi in the north, and Madurai in the south. Both men and women worked in these centers. Many craftspersons and merchants now formed associations known as Shrinas. These Shrinas of craftspersons provided training, procured raw material, and distributed the finished product. Then Shrinas of merchants organized the trade. Shrinas also served as banks, where rich men and women deposited money. This was invested, and part of the interest was returned or used to support religious institutions such as monasteries. A closer look Arakamdu. Find Arakamdu, in Pondicherry, on map 7, and read the box on Rome on page 96. Between 2200 and 1900 years ago, Arakamdu was a coastal settlement where ships unloaded goods from distant lands. A massive brick structure, which may have been a warehouse, was found at the site. Other finds include pottery from the Mediterranean region, such as amphorae, tall double-handled jars that contained liquids such as wine or oil, and stamped red-glazed pottery, known as Artine ware, which was named after a city in Italy. This was made by pressing wet clay into a stamped mold. There was yet another kind of pottery which was made locally, though Roman. Roman lamps, glassware, and gems have also been found at the site. Designs were used. Small tanks have been found that were probably dyeing vats, used to dye cloth. There is plenty of evidence for the making of beads from semi-precious stones and glass. List the evidence that indicates that there was contact with Rome. Elsewhere. Find Rome on map 6. This is one of the oldest cities in Europe, and developed around the same time as the cities in the Gunga Valley. Rome was the capital of one of the largest empires, one that spread across Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. Augustus, one of the most important emperors, who ruled about 2,000 years ago, said that he found Rome a city of brick, and made it into a city of marble. He, and later rulers, built temples and palaces. They also built huge amphitheaters, open arenas surrounded by tiers of seats where citizens could watch all kinds of shows, and public baths where people met and relaxed. Huge aqueducts. Channels to supply water were built to bring water to the city for the baths, fountains, and toilets. Why do you think the amphitheaters and aqueducts have survived? Some important dates. Beginning of the use of iron in the subcontinent, about 3,000 years ago. Increase in the use of iron, cities, punch-marked coins, about 2,500 years ago. Beginning of the composition of Sangam literature, about 2,300 years ago. Settlement in Arakamdu, between 2,200 and 1,900 years ago. The earliest Tamil compositions. Some of the earliest works in Tamil, known as Sangam literature, were composed around 2,300 years ago. These texts were called Sangam because they were supposed to have been composed and compiled in assemblies, known as Sangams, of poets that were held in the city of Madurai. The Tamil terms mentioned above are found in Sangam literature. The clever poor man. Once upon a time, there was a clever poor young man who lived in a city. His only resource was a dead rat. He started off by selling it for a coin to a hotel, for their cat. Then one day, there was a storm. The king's garden was littered with branches and leaves, and the gardener was at a loss as to how to clear the mess. The young man offered to clean the garden if he could keep the wood and leaves. The gardener agreed at once. The young man rounded up all the children who were playing, with an offer of sweets for every stick and leaf that they could collect. In no time, every scrap had been neatly piled near the entrance. Just then, the king's potter was on the lookout for fuel with which to bake his pots. So he took the whole lot and paid the young man for it. Our young man now thought of another plan. He carried a jar full of water to the city gate, and offered water to 500 grass cutters. They were pleased and said, "You have done us a good turn. Tell us, what can we do for you?" He replied, "I shall let you know when I need your help." He then made friends with a trader. One day, the trader told him, "Tomorrow, a horse dealer is coming to town with 500 horses." Hearing this, our young man went back to the grass cutters. He said, "Please give me a bundle of grass each, and do not sell your grass till mine is sold." They agreed, and gave him 500 bundles of grass. When the horse dealer could not buy grass anywhere else, he purchased the young man's grass for 1,000 coins. List the occupations of the persons mentioned in the story. For each one, try and decide whether they would have lived, a. only in the city, b. only in villages, c. in both cities and villages. Why do you think the horse dealer was coming to the city? Do you think women could have taken up the occupations mentioned in the story? Give reasons for your answer. The story of Berigaza, the Greek name for Baruch. The gulf is very narrow at Berigaza, and very hard to navigate for those coming from the sea. Ships had to be steered in by skillful and experienced local fishermen who were employed by the king. The imports into Barigaza were wine, copper, tin, lead, coral, topaz, cloth, gold and silver coins. Exports from the town included plants from the Himalayas, ivory, agate, carnelian, cotton, silk, and perfumes. Special gifts were brought by merchants for the king. These included vessels of silver, singing boys, beautiful women, fine wines, and fine cloth. Make a list of all the things imported and exported from Barigaza. Underline at least 2 things that were not in use during Harappan times. Why do you think merchants brought gifts for the king? Other means of exchange. Read this short poem from the Sangam collection. As they carry the white paddy of their land to exchange it for the salt of another, crossing the long roads in carts, through sands white as moonlight, taking whole families, who hate to be left behind, the departure of the salt merchants leaves the city empty. Salt was produced plentifully along the sea coast. What are the merchants planning to exchange it with? How are they traveling? Rules for spinning and weaving. These rules are from the Artha Shastra, mentioned in Chapter 8. They describe how spinning and weaving could be done in workshops under the supervision of a special official. Widows, young women who are differently abled, nuns, mothers of courtesans, retired women servants of the king, women who have retired from service in temples, may be used for processing wool, bark, cotton, hemp, and flax. They should be paid according to the quality and quantity of work. Permitted to leave their homes can send maid women who are not servants to bring the raw material from the superintendent, and take the finished work back to him. Women who can visit the workshop should go at dawn to give their work and receive their wages. There should be enough light to examine the work. In case the superintendent looks at the woman or talks about anything other than the work, he should be punished. If a woman does not complete her work, she will have to pay a fine, and her thumbs can be cut off. Make a list of all the women who could be employed by the superintendent. Do you think women would have faced any problems while working? Chapter 10. Traders, Kings, and Pilgrims. Jajani at the market. Jajani looked forward to the fair in the village. She loved to see and touch the pots and pans of shiny steel, bright plastic buckets, cloth printed with brilliant floral designs, and clockwork toys, all of which came from the city. The men who spread out their wares came in buses and trucks and went back at the end of the day. Why were they always on the move? She wondered. Her mother explained that they were traders, people who bought things where they were made, and sold them elsewhere. How to find out about trade and traders? You read about the northern black polished ware in Chapter 9. This fine pottery, especially bowls and plates, were found from several archaeological sites throughout the subcontinent. How do you think it reached these places? Traders may have carried them from the places where they were made, to sell them at other places. South India was famous for gold, spices, especially pepper, and precious stones. Pepper was particularly valued in the Roman Empire, so much so that it was known as black gold. So, traders carried many of these goods to Rome in ships, across the sea, and by land in caravans. There must have been quite a lot of trade, as many Roman gold coins have been found in South India. Can you think of how and why these reached India? Ruling families, the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas, who became powerful in South India around 2,300 years ago. Each of the 3 chiefs had 2 centers of power, one inland, and one on the coast. Of these 6 cities, 2 were very important: Pohar or Kavaripatanam, the port of the Cholas, and Madurai, the capital of the Pandyas. The chiefs did not collect regular taxes. Instead, they demanded and received gifts from the people. They also went on military expeditions, and collected tribute from neighboring areas. They kept some of the wealth and distributed the rest amongst their supporters, including members of their family, soldiers, and poets. Many poets whose compositions are found in the Sangam collection composed poems in praise of chiefs. who often rewarded them with precious stones, gold, horses, elephants, chariots, and fine cloth. Around 200 years later, a dynasty known as the Satavahanas became powerful in Western India. The most important ruler of the Satavahanas was Gautamiputra Sri Satakarni. We know about him from an inscription composed by his mother, Gautami Balashri. He and other Satavahana rulers were known as lords of the Dakshinapatha, literally the route leading to the south, which was also used as a name for the entire southern region. He sent his army to the eastern, western and southern coasts. Why do you think he wanted to control the coasts? The story of the Silk Route. The rich, glossy colors of silk, as well as its smooth texture, make it a highly valued fabric in most societies. Making silk is a complicated process. Raw silk has to be extracted from the cocoons of silkworms, spun into thread and then woven into cloth. Techniques of making silk were first invented in China around 7,000 years ago. While the methods remained a closely guarded secret for thousands of years, some people from China who went to distant lands on foot, horseback, and on camels, carried silk with them. The paths they followed came to be known as the Silk Route. Sometimes, Chinese rulers sent gifts of silk to rulers in Iran and West Asia, and from there, the knowledge of silk spread further west. About 2,000 years ago, wearing silk became the fashion amongst rulers and rich people in Rome. It was very expensive, as it had to be brought all the way from China, along dangerous roads, through mountains and deserts. People living along the route often demanded payments for allowing traders to pass through. Look at map 6, which shows the Silk Route and its branches. Some kings tried to control large portions of the route. This was because they could benefit from taxes, tributes, and gifts that were brought by traders traveling along the route. In return, they often protected the traders who passed through their kingdoms from attacks by robbers. The best known of the rulers who controlled the Silk Route were the Kushanas, who ruled over Central Asia and Northwest India around 2,000 years ago. Their two major centers of power were Peshawar and Mathura. Taxila was also included in their kingdom. During their rule, a branch of the Silk Route extended from Central Asia down to the seaports at the mouth of the river Indus, from where silk was shipped westwards to the Roman Empire. The Kushanas were amongst the earliest rulers of the subcontinent to issue gold coins. These were used by traders along the Silk Route. Why do you think it would have been difficult to use carts along the Silk Route? Silk was also sent from China by sea. Trace the routes on map 6. What do you think would have been the advantages and problems in transporting silk by sea? The spread of Buddhism. The most famous Kushana ruler was Kanishka, who ruled around 1900 years ago. He organized a Buddhist council, where scholars met and discussed important matters. Ashvaghosha, a poet who composed a biography of the Buddha, the Buddhakarita, lived in his court. Ashvaghosha and other Buddhist scholars now began writing in Sanskrit. A new form of Buddhism, known as Mahayana Buddhism, now developed. This had two distinct features. Earlier, the Buddha's presence was shown in sculpture by using certain signs. For instance, his attainment of enlightenment was shown by sculptures of the peepal tree. Now, statues of the Buddha were made. Many of these were made in Mathura, while others were made in Taxila. The second change was a belief in bodhisattvas. These were supposed to be persons who had attained enlightenment. Once they attained enlightenment, they could live in complete isolation and meditate in peace. However, instead of doing that, they remained in the world to teach and help other people. The worship of bodhisattvas became very popular, and spread throughout Central Asia, China, and later to Korea and Japan. Buddhism also spread to western and southern India, where dozens of caves were hollowed out of hills for monks to live in. Some of these caves were made on the orders of kings and queens, others by merchants and farmers. These were often located near passes through the Western Ghats. Roads connecting prosperous ports on the coast with cities in the Deccan ran through these passes. Traders probably halted in these cave monasteries during their travels. Buddhism also spread southeastwards, to Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and other parts of Southeast Asia including Indonesia. The older form of Buddhism, known as Theravada Buddhism, was more popular in these areas. The quest of the pilgrims. As traders journeyed to distant lands in caravans and ships, pilgrims often traveled with them. The best known of these are the Chinese Buddhist pilgrims, Fa Xian, who came to the subcontinent about 1,600 years ago, Xuanzang, who came around 1,400 years ago, and I Ching, who came about 50 years after Xuanzang. They came to visit places associated with the life of the Buddha as well as famous monasteries. Each of these pilgrims left an account of his journey. They wrote of the dangers they encountered on their travels, which often took years, of the countries and the monasteries that they visited, and the books they carried back with them. Xuanzang, who took the land route back to China, through the northwest, and central Asia, carried back with him statues of the Buddha made of gold, silver, and sandalwood, and over 600 manuscripts loaded on the backs of 20 horses. Over 50 manuscripts were lost when the boat on which he was crossing the Indus capsized. He spent the rest of his life translating the remaining manuscripts from Sanskrit into Chinese. The beginning of Bhakti. This was also the time when the worship of certain deities, which became a central feature of later Hinduism, gained in importance. These deities included Shiva, Vishnu, and goddesses such as Durga. These deities were worshipped through bhakti, an idea that became very popular at this time. Bhakti is generally understood as a person's devotion to his or her chosen deity. Anybody, whether rich or poor, belonging to the so-called high or low castes, man or woman, could follow the path of bhakti. The idea of bhakti is present in the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred book of the Hindus, which is included in the Mahabharata. In this, Krishna the god asks Arjuna, his devotee and friend, to abandon all dharmas and take refuge in him, as only he can set Arjuna free from every evil. This form of worship gradually spread to different parts of the country. Those who followed the system of bhakti emphasized devotion and individual worship of a god or goddess, rather than the performance of elaborate sacrifices. According to this system of belief, if a devotee worships the chosen deity with a pure heart, the deity will appear in the form in which he or she may desire. So, the deity could be thought of as a human being, lion, tree, or any other form. Once this idea gained acceptance, artists made beautiful images of these deities. Bhakti comes from the Sanskrit term bhaj, meaning to divide or share. This suggests an intimate, two-way relationship between the deity and the devotee. Bhakti is directed towards Bhagavat, which is often translated as God, but also means one who possesses and shares bhaga, literally, good fortune or bliss. The devotee, known as the Bhakta or the Bhagavata, shares his or her chosen deity's bhaga. Because the deities were special, these images of the deity were often placed within special homes, places that we describe as temples. You will learn more about these temples in Chapter 12. Bhakti inspired some of the best expressions in art, sculpture, poetry, and architecture. Elsewhere. About 2,000 years ago, Christianity emerged in West Asia. Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, which was then part of the Roman Empire. Christ's teachings were that he was the savior of the world. He also taught people to treat others with love and trust others, just as they themselves wanted to be treated. Here are a few verses from the Bible, the holy book that contains the teachings of Christ. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Christ's teachings appealed to ordinary people, and spread through West Asia, Africa, and Europe. The first Christian preachers came from West Asia to the west coast of the subcontinent within 100 years of Christ's death. Look at map 6 and trace out the route that they may have used. The Christians of Kerala, known as Syrian Christians because they probably came from West Asia, are amongst the oldest Christian communities in the world. Imagine you have a manuscript which a Chinese pilgrim would like to carry back with him. Describe your conversation. Some important dates. Discovery of silk making, about 7,000 years ago. The Cholas, Cheras and Pandyas, about 2,300 years ago. Growing demand for silk in the Roman Empire, about 2,000 years ago. Kanishka, the Kushana ruler, about 1900 years ago. Fasyen comes to India, about 1,600 years ago. Xuanzang comes to India, Apar composes devotional poems in praise of Shiva, about 1,400 years ago. A poem about trade. We can find evidence of trade in the Sangam poems. Here is one which describes the goods brought into Puhar, an important port on the east coast. Here are brought, swift, prancing horses by sea in ships, bales of black pepper in carts. Gems and gold born in the Himalayas, sandalwood born in the western hills, the pearls of the southern seas, and corals from the eastern oceans. The yield of the Ganga and the crops from the Kaveri, foodstuffs from Sri Lanka, pottery from Myanmar, and other rare and rich imports. Make a list of all the things that are mentioned. What would they be used for? How Fasyen returned to China. Fasyen began his journey back home from Bengal. He boarded a ship belonging to some merchants. They had barely traveled for 2 days when they were caught in a storm. The merchants began throwing their merchandise overboard so as to lighten the load and save the ship from sinking. Fasyen threw away his meager personal belongings, but clung to his books and the statues of the Buddha that he had collected. Finally, the storm subsided after 13 days. This is how he describes the sea. The sea itself is boundless in extent. It is impossible to know east or west, except by observing the sun, moon, or stars in their motions. If it is dark, rainy weather, the only plan is to steer by the wind. It took him more than 90 days to reach Java, where he halted for 5 months, before boarding another merchant ship that took him to China. Try and trace the route Fasyen took on map 6. Why do you think he did not want to throw away his books and statues? Nalanda, a unique center of Buddhist learning. Xuanzang and other pilgrims spent time studying in Nalanda, Bihar, the most famous Buddhist monastery of the period. This is how he describes it. The teachers are men of the highest ability and talent. They follow the teachings of the Buddha in all sincerity. The rules of the monastery are strict, and everyone has to follow them. Discussions are held throughout the day, and the old and the young mutually help one another. Learned men from different cities come here to settle their doubts. The gatekeeper asks new entrants difficult questions. They are allowed to enter only after they have been able to answer these. 7 or 8 out of every 10 are not able to answer. List the reasons why Xuanzang wanted to study in Nalanda. A poem by a Bhakta. Most Bhakta literature tells us that riches, learning and high status do not automatically ensure a close relationship with the deity. This is part of a poem composed in Tamil by Apar, a devotee of Shiva, who lived about 1,400 years ago. Apar was a Velila, the leper with rotting limbs. The man who is regarded as low by the Brahmin, even the scavenger. Even these men, if they are servants, i.e. devotees of him who shelters the Ganga in his long hair, i.e. Shiva, I worship them, they are gods to me. What does the poet regard as more valuable, social status or devotion? Hindu. The word Hindu, like the term India, is derived from the river Indus. It was used by Arabs and Iranians to refer to people who lived to the east of the river, and to their cultural practices, including religious beliefs. Chapter 11. New Empires and Kingdoms. Arvind plays a king. Arvind had been chosen to act as a king in the school play. He had expected to march solemnly in splendid robes, to twirl his mustaches and wield the silver paper-wrapped sword with gusto. Imagine his surprise when he was told he would also have to sit and play a veena, and recite poetry. A musician king? Who was that? He wondered. Prashastis and what they tell us. Arvind was supposed to be acting as Samudragupta, a famous ruler of a dynasty known as the Guptas. We know about Samudragupta from a long inscription. Actually a poem in Sanskrit, composed by his court poet, Harishena nearly 1700 years ago. This was inscribed on the Ashokan pillar at Allahabad. This inscription is of a special kind known as a prashasti, a Sanskrit word meaning in praise of. While prashastis were composed for some of the rulers you read about in chapter 10, such as Gautamaputra Sri Satakarni, they became far more important from the time of the Guptas. Samudragupta's prashasti. Let us see what Samudragupta's prashasti tells us. The poet praised the king in glowing terms as a warrior, as a king who won victories in battle, who was learned and the best of poets. He is also described as equal to the gods. The prashasti was composed in very long sentences. Here is part of one such sentence. If you look at map 7, you will notice an area shaded in green. You will also find a series of red dots along the east coast. And you will find areas marked in purple and blue as well. This map is based on the information provided in the prashasti. Harishena describes 4 different kinds of rulers, and tells us about Samudragupta's policies towards them. 1. The rulers of Aryavarta, the area shaded in green on the map. Here the were 9 rulers who were uprooted, and their kingdoms were made a part of Samudragupta's empire. 2. The rulers of Dakshinapatha. Here there were 12 rulers, some of whose capitals are marked with red dots on the map. They surrendered to Samudragupta after being defeated and he then allowed them to rule again. 3. The inner circle of neighbouring states, including Assam, coastal Bengal, Nepal, and a number of Ghana Sungas in the northwest, marked in purple on the map. They brought tribute, followed his orders, and attended his court. 4. The rulers of the outlying areas, marked in blue on the map, perhaps the descendants of the Kushanas and Shakas, and the ruler of Sri Lanka, who submitted to him and offered daughters in marriage. Find Prayaga, the old name for Allahabad, Ujjain, and Pataliputra, Putna, on the map. These were important centers of the Gupta rulers. What was the difference between the way in which Samudragupta treated the rulers of Aryavarta and Dakshinapatha? Can you suggest any reasons for this difference? Genealogies. Most prashastis also mention the ancestors of the ruler. Samudragupta's great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and mother. This one mentions his mother, Kumara Devi, belonged to the Likshhavigana, while his father, Chandragupta, was the first ruler of the Gupta dynasty to adopt the grand title of Maharajadhiraja, a title that Samudragupta also used. His great-grandfather and grandfather are mentioned simply as Maharajas. It seems as if the family gradually rose to importance. Arrange these titles in order of importance: Raja, Maharajadhiraja, Maharaja. Samudragupta in turn figures in the genealogies, lists of ancestors, of later rulers of the dynasty, such as his son, Chandragupta II. We know about him from inscriptions and coins. He led an expedition to western India, where he overcame the last of the Shakas. According to later belief, his court was full of learned people, including Kalidasa the poet, and Aryabhata the astronomer, about whom you will read more in chapter 12. Harshavardhana and the Harshakarita. While we can learn about the Gupta rulers from their inscriptions and coins, we can find out about some kings from biographies. Harshavardhana, who ruled nearly 1,400 years ago, was one such ruler. His court poet, Banabhata, wrote His biography, They Harshakarita, in Sanskrit. This gives us the genealogy of Harsha, and ends with his becoming king. Xuanzang, about whom you read in chapter 10, also spent a lot of time at Harsha's court and left a detailed account of what he saw. Harsha was not the eldest son of his father, but became king of Thainsar after both his father and elder brother died. His brother-in-law was the ruler of Kanauai and he was killed by the ruler of Bengal. Harsha took over the kingdom of Kanauai, and then led an army against the ruler of Bengal. Although he was successful in the east, and conquered both Magadha and Bengal, he was not as successful elsewhere. He tried to cross the Narmada to march into the Deccan, but was stopped by a ruler belonging to the Chalukya dynasty, Pulakshin II. The Pallavas, Chalukyas, and Pulakshins Prashasti. The Pallavas and Chalukyas were the most important ruling dynasties in South India. During this period, the kingdom of the Pallavas spread from the region around their capital, Kanchipuram, to the Kaveri Delta, while that of the Chalukyas was centered around the Raichur Dube, between the rivers Krishna and Tungabhadra. Aihole, the capital of the Chalukyas, was an important trading center. It developed as a religious center, with a number of temples. The Pallavas and Chalukyas frequently raided one another's lands, especially attacking the capital cities, which were prosperous towns. The best-known Chalukya ruler was Pulakshin II. We know about him from a Prashasti, composed by his court poet Ravikirti. This tells us about his ancestors, who are traced back through 4 generations from father to son. Pulakshin evidently got the kingdom from his uncle. According to Ravikirti, he led expeditions along both the west and the east coasts. Besides, he checked the advance of Harsha. There is an interesting play of words in the poem. Harsha means happiness. The poet says that after this defeat, Harsha was no longer Harsha. Pulakshin also attacked the Pallava king, who took shelter behind the walls of Kanchipuram. But the Chalukya victory was short-lived. Ultimately, both the Pallavas and the Chalukyas gave way to new rulers belonging to the Rashtrakuta and Chola dynasties, about which you will study in class 7th. How were these kingdoms administered? As in the case of earlier kings, land revenue remained important for these rulers, and the village remained the basic unit of administration. There were some new developments as well. Kings adopted a number of steps to win the support of men who were powerful, either economically, or socially, or because of their political and military strength. For instance, some important administrative posts were now hereditary. This means that sons succeeded fathers to these posts. For example, the poet Harishina was a Mahadandanayak, or chief judicial officer, like his father. Sometimes, one person held many offices. For instance, besides being a Mahadandanayak, Harishina was a Kumaramatya, meaning an important minister, and a Sandhivigrahika, meaning a minister of war and peace. Besides, important men probably had a say in local administration. These included the Nagara Shreshthi or chief banker or merchant of the city, the Sarthavaha or leader of the merchant caravans, the Prathamakolaka or the chief craftsman, and the head of the Kayasthas or scribes. These policies were reasonably effective, but sooner or later, some of these powerful men grew strong enough to set up independent kingdoms. What do you think may have been the advantages and disadvantages of having hereditary officers? A new kind of army. Like earlier rulers, some of these kings maintained a well-organized army, with elephants, chariots, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Besides, there were military leaders who provided the king with troops whenever he needed them. They were not paid regular salaries. Instead, some of them received grants of land. They collected revenue from the land and used this to maintain soldiers and horses, and provide equipment for warfare. These men were known as Samantas. Whenever the ruler was weak, Samantas tried to become independent. Assemblies in the southern kingdoms. The inscriptions of the Pallavas mention a number of local assemblies. These included the Sava, which was an assembly of Brahmin landowners. This assembly functioned through subcommittees, which looked after irrigation, agricultural roads, local temples, etc. operations, making. The was a village assembly found in areas where the landowners were not Brahmins, and the Nagaram was an organization of merchants. It is likely that these assemblies were controlled by rich and powerful landowners and merchants. Many of these local assemblies continued to function for centuries. Ordinary people in the kingdoms. We can catch an occasional glimpse of the lives of ordinary people from plays and other accounts. Let us look at some of these. Kalidasa is known for his plays depicting life in the king's court. An interesting feature about these plays is that the king and most Brahmins are shown as speaking Sanskrit, while women and men other than the king and Brahmins use Prakrit. His most famous play, Abhijanana Shakuntalam, is the story of the love between a king named Dushyanta and a young woman named Shakuntala. We find an interesting description of the plight of a poor fisherman in this play. The Chinese pilgrim Fa Xian noticed the plight of those who were treated as untouchables by the high and mighty. They were expected to live on the outskirts of the city. He writes, if such a man enters a town or a marketplace, he strikes a piece of wood, in order to keep himself separate. People, hearing this sound, know what it means and avoid touching him or brushing against him. And Banabhata provides us with a vivid picture of the king's army on the move. Elsewhere. Find Arabia on map 6. Although it is a desert, it was at the hub of communications for centuries. In fact, Arab merchants and sailors played an important role in the sea trade between India and Europe. Others who lived in Arabia were the Bedouins, pastoral tribes. Depending mainly on like hardy animals, camels, that could survive in the desert. Around 1400 years ago, Prophet Muhammad introduced a new religion, Islam, in Arabia. Like Christianity, Islam was a religion that laid stress on the equality and unity of all before Allah, the one supreme God. Here is a verse from the Quran, the sacred book of Islam. For Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in Allah's remembrance, for them has Allah prepared forgiveness and great reward. Within 100 years Islam spread to North Africa, Spain, Iran, and India. Arab sailors, who were already familiar with the coastal settlements of the subcontinent, now brought the new religion with them. Arab soldiers conquered Sindh, in present-day Pakistan, about 1,300 years ago. Some important dates. Beginning of the Gupta dynasty, about 1,700 years ago. The rule of Harshavardhana, about 1,400 years ago. Samudragupta the warrior, whose body was most charming, being covered with the plenteous beauty of the marks of hundreds of scars caused by battle axes, arrows, spikes, spears, barbed darts, swords, iron clubs, javelins, barbed arrows, long arrows and many other weapons. What does this description tell you about the king? And also about how kings fought wars? A fisherman finds a ring. A fisherman found a precious ring, which the king had given to Shakuntala, but which had been accidentally swallowed by a fish. When he went to the palace with it, the gatemen accused him of theft, and the chief police officer was rather rude. However, the king was happy when he saw the ring and sent a reward for the fisherman. Then, the police officer and the gatemen decided to take a share of the reward, and went along with the fisherman to have a drink. Do you think that if a poor man finds something and reports this to the police he would be treated like this today? The king's army. The king traveled with an enormous amount of equipment. Apart from weapons, there were things of daily use such as pots, pans, furniture, golden footstools, food, including animals such as goat, deer, rabbits, vegetables, spices, carried on carts or loaded onto pack animals such as camels and elephants. This huge army was accompanied by musicians beating drums, and others playing horns and trumpets. Villagers had to provide hospitality along the way. They came with gifts of curds, gur, and flowers, and provided fodder for the animals. They also tried to meet the king, and place their complaints and petitions before him. The army left a trail of destruction behind. Elephants often trampled down the huts of villagers, and the oxen yoked to the caravans of merchants ran away, scared by the tumult. As Banabhata says, the whole world was swallowed up in dust. Make a list of all the things that were carried with the army. What did the villagers bring for the king? Chapter 12. Buildings, Paintings, and Books. Marutasami and the Iron Pillar. Marutasami was so excited. His brother had propelled his wheelchair all along the dusty, stony path, past the towering Qutb Minar, and up the metal ramp. It had been tough, but now he was here, in front of the famous Iron Pillar. It was an unforgettable experience. The Iron Pillar. The Iron Pillar at Mehrauli, Delhi, is a remarkable example of the skill of Indian craftspersons. It is made of iron, 7.2 m high, and weighs over 3 tons. It was made about 1,500 years ago. We know the date because there is an inscription on the pillar mentioning a ruler named Chandra, who probably belonged to the Gupta dynasty. What is amazing is the fact that the pillar has not rusted in all these years. Buildings in brick and stone. The skills of our crafts persons are also apparent in the buildings that have survived, such as stupas. The word stupa means a mound. While there are several kinds of stupas, round and tall, big and small, these have certain common features. Generally, there is a small box placed at the center or heart of the stupa. This may contain bodily remains, such as teeth, bone, or ashes, of the Buddha or his followers, coins, or things they used, as well as precious stones, and this box, known as a relic casket, was covered with earth. Later, a layer of mud brick or baked brick was added on top. And then, the dome-like structure was sometimes covered Pradakshina was with carved stone slabs. Often, a path, known as the laid around the stupa. This was surrounded with railings. Entrance to the path was through gateways. Devotee walked around the stupa, in a clockwise direction, as a mark of devotion. Both railings and gateways were often decorated with sculpture. Find Amaravati on map. This was a place where a magnificent stupa once existed. Many of the stone carvings for decorating the stupa were made about 2,000 years ago. Other buildings were artificial caves. Some, hollowed out of rock to make of these, were very elaborately decorated with sculptures and painted walls. Some of the earliest Hindu temples were also built at this time. Deities such as Vishnu, Shiva, and Durga were worshipped in these shrines. The most important part of the temple was the room known as the Garbhagriha, where the image of the chief deity was placed. It was here that priests performed religious rituals, and devotees offered worship to the deity. Often, as at Pitarjayan, a tower, known as the Shikhara, was built on top of the Garbhagriha, to mark this out as a sacred place. Building Shikharas required careful planning. Most temples also had a space could assemble, known as the Mandapa. It was a hall where people find Mahabalipuram and Aihole on map. Some of the finest stone temples were built in these towns. Some of these are shown here. How were stupas and temples built? There were several stages in building a stupa or a temple. Usually, kings or queens decided to build these as it was an expensive affair. First, good quality Stone had to be found, quarried, and transported to the place. That was often carefully chosen for the new building. Here, these rough blocks of stone had to be shaped and carved into pillars, and panels for walls, floors, and ceilings. And then these had to be placed in precisely the right position. Kings and queens probably spent money from their treasury to pay the craftspersons who worked to build these splendid structures. Besides, when devotees came to visit the temple or the stupa, they often brought gifts, which were used to decorate the buildings. For example, an association of ivory workers paid for one of the beautiful gateways at Sanchi. Among the others who paid for decorations were merchants, farmers, garland makers, perfumers, smiths, and hundreds of men and women who are known only by their names, which were inscribed on pillars, railings and walls. So when you get a chance to visit any of these buildings, remember how several hundreds of people probably worked to construct and decorate them. Painting. Find Ajunta on map 7. This is a place where several caves were hollowed out of the hills over centuries. Most of these were monasteries for Buddhist monks, and some of them were decorated with paintings. Here are some examples. As the caves are dark inside, most of these paintings were done in the light of torches. The colors, which are vivid even after 1,500 years, were made of plants and minerals. The artists who created these splendid works of art remain unknown. The world of books. Some of the best-known epics were written during this period. Epics are grand, long compositions, about heroic men and women, and include stories about gods. A famous Tamil epic, the Silappatikaram, was composed by a poet named Elango, around 1,800 years ago. It is the story of a merchant named Kovalan, who lived in Puhar and fell in love with a courtesan named Madhavi, neglecting his wife Kannagi. Later, he and Kannagi left Puhar and went to Madurai, where he was wrongly accused of theft by the court jeweler of the Pandya king. The king sentenced Kovalan to death. Kannagi, who still loved him, was full of grief and anger at this injustice, and destroyed the entire city of Madurai. Another Tamil epic, the Manamekalai, was composed by Satanar around 1,400 years ago. This describes the story of the daughter of Kovalan and Madhavi. These beautiful compositions were lost to scholars for many centuries, till their manuscripts were rediscovered, about 100 years ago. Other writers, such as Kalidasa, wrote in Sanskrit, recording and preserving old stories. A number of Hindu religious stories that were in circulation earlier were written down around the same time. These include the Puranas. Purana literally mean old. The Puranas contain stories about gods and goddesses, such as Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, or Parvati. They also contain details on how they were to be worshipped. Besides, there are accounts about the creation of about kings, the world, and the Puranas were written in simple Sanskrit verse, and were meant to be heard by everybody, including women and Shudras, who were not allowed to study the Vedas. They were probably recited in temples by priests, and people came to listen to them. Two Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, had been popular for a very long time. Some of you may be familiar with these stories. The Mahabharata is about a war fought between the Kauravas and Pandavas, who were cousins. This was a war to gain control of the throne of the Kurus, and their capital, Hastinapur. The story itself was an old one, but was written down in the form in which we know it today, about 1,500 years ago. Both the Puranas and the Mahabharata are supposed to have been compiled by Vyasa. The Bhagavad Gita, about which you Mahabharata learned in chapter 10, was also included in the Ramayana is about Rama, a prince of Kosala, who was sent into exile. His wife Sita was abducted by the king of Lanka, named Ravana, and Rama had to fight a battle to get her back. He won and returned to Ayodhya, the capital of Kosala, after his victory. Like the Mahabharata, this was an old story that was now written down. Valmiki is recognized as the author of the Sanskrit Ramayana. There are several versions, many of which are performed, of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, popular amongst people in the subcontinent. Find out about a version in your state. Different parts of stories told by ordinary people. Ordinary people also told stories, composed poems and songs, sang, danced, and performed plays. Some of these are preserved in collections of stories such as the Jatakas and the Panchatantra, which were written down around this time. Stories from the Jatakas were often shown on the railings of stupas and in paintings in places such as Ajanta. Here is one such story. Writing books on science. This was also the time when Aryabhata, a mathematician and astronomer, wrote a book in Sanskrit known as the Aryabhatiyam. He stated that day and night were caused by the rotation of the earth on its axis, even though it seems as if the sun is rising and setting every day. He developed a scientific explanation for eclipses as well. He also found a way of calculating the circumference of a circle, which is nearly as accurate as the formula we use today. Elsewhere, paper has become a part of our daily lives. The books we read are printed on paper, and we use paper for writing. Paper was invented in China about 1900 years ago, by a man named Cai Lun. He beat plant fibers, cloth, rope, and the bark of trees, soaked these in water, and then pressed, drained, and dried the pulp to create paper. Even today, handmade paper is made through a similar process. The technique of making paper was a closely guarded secret for centuries. It reached Korea about 1,400 years ago, and spread to Japan soon after. It was known in Baghdad about 1,800 years ago. From Baghdad it spread to Europe, Africa, and other parts of Asia including the subcontinent. What were manuscripts in early India made out of? Some important dates. Beginning of stupa building, 2,300 years ago. Amaravati, 2,000 years ago. Kalidasa, 1,600 years ago. Iron pillar, temple at Pitarjiaon, paintings at Ajanta, Aryabhata, 1,500 years ago. Durga temple, 1400 years ago. A description from the Silapatakaram. Here is how the poet describes Kanagis grief. O witness of my grief, you cannot console me. Is it right that your body, fairer than pure gold, lies unwashed here in the dust? Is it just that in the red glow of the twilight, your handsome chest, framed with a flower wreath, lies thrown down on the bare earth, while I remain alone, helpless and abandoned to despair? Is there no God? Is there no God in this country? Can there be a God in a land where the sword of the king is used for the murder of innocent strangers? Is there no God, no God? A verse from the Meghaduta. Here is a verse from Kalidasa's best-known poem, the Meghaduta, in which a monsoon cloud is imagined to be a messenger between lovers who are separated from one another. See how the poet describes the breeze that will carry the cloud northwards, a cool breeze, delightful as it is touched with the fragrance of the earth swollen by your showers, inhaled deeply by elephants, and causing the wild figs to ripen, will blow gently as you go. Do you think Kalidasa can be described as a lover of nature? The story of the Monkey King. Once upon a time there was a great monkey king, who lived on the banks of the Ganga in the Himalayas, with 80,000 followers. They fed on the fruit of a special mango tree, which were very sweet. Such exquisite mangoes did not grow on the plains. One day, a ripe mango fell into the river and floated all the way to Varanasi. There the king of the city who was bathing in the river found it, and was amazed when he tasted it. He asked the foresters of his kingdom whether they could find the tree for him, and they led him all the way to the Himalayas. There, the king and his courtiers had their fill of mangoes. At night, the king discovered that the monkeys were also feasting on the fruit, and decided to kill them. However, the king of the monkeys worked out a plan to save his followers. He broke off branches of the mango tree, and tied them to form a bridge across the river, and held on to one end till all his followers crossed over. Exhausted with the effort, he fell down and lay dying. The human king saw what had happened, and tried unsuccessfully to revive the monkey. When he died, the king mourned his death and paid him full respect. This story is shown on a piece of sculpture found from a stupa at Bharhut in central India. Can you identify which parts of the story are shown in the sculpture? Why do you think these were chosen? 0. While numerals had been used earlier, mathematicians in India now invented a special symbol for 0. This system of counting was adapted by the Arabs and then spread to Europe. It continues to be in use throughout the world. The Romans used a system of counting without using 0. Try and find out more about it. Contents. Foreword. In this book. 1. Tracing changes through 1,000 years. 2. New kings and kingdoms. 3. The Delhi Sultans. 4. The Mughal Empire. 5. Rulers and buildings. 6. Towns, traders, and craftspersons. 7. Tribes, nomads, and settled communities. 8. Devotional paths to the divine. 9. The making of regional cultures. 10. 18th century political formations. 1. Tracing changes through 1,000 years. Take a look at Maps 1 and 2. Map 1 was made in 1154 CE by the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi. The section reproduced here is a detail of the Indian subcontinent from his larger map of the world. Map 2 was made in the 1720s by a French cartographer. The two maps are quite different even though they are of the same area. In Al-Idrisi's map, South India is where we would expect to find North India and Sri Lanka is the island at the top. Place names are marked in Arabic, and there are some well-known names like Kanawai in Uttar Pradesh, spelt in the map as Kanawai. Map 2 was made nearly 600 years after the first, during which time information about the subcontinent had changed considerably. This map seems more familiar to us and the coastal areas in particular are surprisingly detailed. This map was used by European sailors and merchants on their voyages. But look at the areas inland. Equally important is the fact that the science of cartography differed in the two periods. When historians read documents, maps, and texts from the past, they have to be sensitive to the different historical backgrounds, the contexts in which information about the past was produced. New and old terminologies. If the context in which information is produced changes with time, what about language and meanings? Historical records exist in a variety of languages which have changed considerably over the years. Medieval Persian, for example, is different from modern Persian. The difference is not just with regard to grammar and vocabulary, the meanings of words also change over time. Take the term Hindustan, for example. Today we understand it as India, the modern nation-state. When the term was used in the 13th century by Minhaj Siraj, a chronicler who wrote in Persian, he meant the areas of Punjab, Haryana, and the lands between the Ganga and Yamuna. He used the term in a political sense for lands that were a part of the dominions of the Delhi Sultan. The areas included in this term shifted with the extent of the Sultanate, but the term never included South India within it. By contrast, in the early 16th century Babur used Hindustan to describe the geography, the fauna, and the culture of the inhabitants of the subcontinent. As we will see later in the chapter, this was somewhat similar to the way the 14th century poet Amir Khusrau used the word Hind. While the idea of a geographical and cultural entity like India did exist, the term Hindustan did not carry the political and national meanings which we associate with it today. Historians have to be careful about the terms they use because they meant different things in the past. Take, for example, a simple term like foreigner. It is used today. to mean someone who is not an Indian. In the medieval period, a foreigner was any stranger who appeared, say, in a given village, someone who was not a part of that society or culture. In Hindi the term Pardesi might be used to describe such a person, and in Persian, Ajnabi. A city dweller, therefore, might have regarded a forest dweller as a foreigner, but two peasants living in the same village were not foreigners to each other, even though they may have had different religious or caste backgrounds. Historians and their sources. Historians use different types of sources to learn about the past depending upon the period of their study and the nature of their investigation. Last year, for example, you read about rulers of the Gupta dynasty in Harshavardhana. In this book we will read about the following 1000 years, from roughly 700 to 1750 CE. You will notice some continuity in the sources used by historians for the study of this period. They still rely upon coins, inscriptions, architecture and textual records for information. But there is also considerable discontinuity. The number and variety of textual records increased dramatically during this period. They slowly displaced other types of available information. Through this period, paper gradually became cheaper and more widely available. People used it to write holy texts, chronicles of rulers, letters and teachings of saints, petitions and judicial records, and for registers of accounts and taxes. Manuscripts were collected by wealthy people, rulers, monasteries, and temples. They were placed in libraries and archives. These manuscripts and documents provide a lot of detailed information to historians, but they are also difficult to use. There was no printing press in those days, so scribes copied manuscripts by hand. If you have ever copied a friend's homework, you would know that this is not a simple exercise. Sometimes you cannot read your friend's handwriting and are forced to guess what is written. As a result, there are small but significant differences in your copy of your friend's work. Manuscript copying is somewhat similar. As scribes copied manuscripts, they also introduced small changes, a word here, a sentence there. These small differences grew over centuries of copying until manuscripts of the same text became substantially different from one another. This is a serious problem because we rarely find the original manuscript of the author today. We are totally dependent upon the copies made by later scribes. As a result, historians have to read different manuscript versions of the same text to guess what the author had originally written. On occasion, authors revised their chronicles at different times. The 14th century chronicler Ziauddin Barani wrote his chronicle first in 1356 and another version 2 years later. The two differ from each other, but historians did not know about the existence of the first version until 1971. It remained lost in large library collections. New social and political groups. The study of the 1000 years between 700 and 1750 is a huge challenge to historians, largely because of the scale and variety of developments that occurred over the period. At different moments in this period, new technologies made their appearance, like the Persian wheel in irrigation, the spinning wheel in weaving, and firearms in combat. New foods and beverages arrived in the subcontinent: potatoes, corn, chilies, tea, and coffee. Remember that all these innovations, new technologies and crops came along with people, who brought other ideas with them as well. As a result, this was a period of economic, political, social, and cultural changes. You will learn about some of these changes in chapters 5, 6, and 7. This was also a period of great mobility. Groups of people traveled long distances in search of opportunity. The subcontinent held immense wealth and the possibilities for people to carve a fortune. One group of people who became important in this period were the Rajputs, a name derived from Rajaputra, the son of a ruler. Between the 8th and 14th centuries, the term was applied more generally to a body of warriors who claimed Kshatriya caste status. The term included not just rulers and chieftains but also soldiers and commanders who served in the armies of different monarchs all over the subcontinent. A chivalric code of conduct, extreme valor, and a great sense of loyalty were the qualities attributed to Rajputs by their poets and bards. Other groups of people such as the Marathas, Sikhs, Jats, Ahums, and Kasthas, a caste of scribes and secretaries, also used the opportunities of the age to become politically important. Throughout this period there was a gradual clearing of forests and the extension of agriculture, a change faster and more complete in some areas than in others. Changes in their habitat forced many forest dwellers to migrate. Others started tilling the land and became peasants. These new peasant groups gradually began to be influenced by regional markets, chieftains, priests, monasteries, and temples. They became part of large complex societies, and were required to pay taxes and offer goods and services to local lords. As a result, significant economic and social differences emerged amongst peasants. Some possessed more productive land, others also kept cattle, and some combined artisanal work with agricultural activity during the lean season. As society became more differentiated, people were grouped into jadis or subcastes and ranked on the basis of their backgrounds and their occupations. Ranks were not fixed permanently, and varied according to the power, influence, and resources controlled by members of the jati. The status of the same jati could vary from area to area. Jatis framed their own rules and regulations to manage the conduct of their members. These regulations were enforced by an assembly of elders, described in some areas as the Jati Panchayat. But Jatis were also required to follow the rules of their villages. Several villages were governed by a chieftain. Together they were only one small unit of a state. Region and empire. Large states like those of the Cholas, Tughluks, or Mughals encompassed many regions. A Sanskrit prashasti for an example of a prashasti, praising the Delhi Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban, 1266 to 1287, explained that he was the ruler of a vast empire that stretched from Bengal, Gauda, in the east to Ghazni, Gajana, in Afghanistan in the west and included all of South India, Dravida. People of different regions Gauda, Andhra, Kerala, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Gujarat apparently fled before his armies. Historians regard these as exaggerated claims of conquests. At the same time, they try to understand why rulers kept claiming to have control over different parts of the subcontinent. By 700 many regions already possessed distinct geographical dimensions and their own language and cultural characteristics. You will learn more about these in Chapter 9. They were also associated with specific ruling dynasties. There was considerable conflict between these states. Occasionally dynasties like the Cholas, Khaljas, Tughluks, and Mughals were able to build an empire that was pan-regional spanning diverse regions. Not all these empires were equally stable or successful. Compare, for example, Tables 1 in Chapters 3 and 4. What was the duration of rule of the Khalji and Mughal dynasties? When the Mughal Empire declined in the 18th century, it led to the re-emergence of regional states. But years of imperial, pan-regional rule had altered the character of the regions. Across most of the subcontinent the regions were left with the legacies of the big and small states that ruled over them. This was apparent in the emergence of many distinct and shared traditions, in the realms of governance, the management of the economy, elite cultures, and language. Through the 1,000 years between 700 and 1750 the character of the different regions did not grow in isolation. They felt the impact of larger pan-regional forces of integration without ever quite losing their distinctiveness. Old and new religions. The 1,000 years of history that we are exploring witnessed major developments in religious traditions. People's belief in the divine was sometimes deeply personal, but more usually it was collective. Collective belief in a supernatural agency religion was often closely connected with the social and economic organization of local communities. As the social worlds of these groups altered, so too did their beliefs. It was during this period that important changes occurred in what we call Hinduism today. These included the worship of new deities, the construction of temples by royalty and the growing importance of Brahmanas, the priests, as dominant groups in society. Their knowledge of Sanskrit texts earned the Brahmanas a lot of respect in society. Their dominant position was consolidated by the support of their patrons, new rulers searching for prestige. One of the major developments was the emergence of the idea of bhakti, of a loving, personal deity that devotees could reach without the aid of priests or elaborate rituals. You will be learning about this, and other traditions, in Chapter 8. This was also the period when new religions appeared in the subcontinent. Merchants and migrants first brought the teachings of the Holy Quran to India in the 7th century. Muslims regard the Quran as their holy book and accept the sovereignty of the one God, Allah, whose love, mercy, and beauty embrace all those who believe in Him, without regard to social background. Many rulers were patrons of Islam and the ulama learned theologians and jurists. And like Hinduism, Islam was interpreted in a variety of ways by its followers. There were the Shia Muslims who believed that the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali, was the legitimate leader of the Muslim community, and the Sunni Muslims who accepted the authority of the early leaders, Khalifas, of the community, and the succeeding Khalifas. There were other important differences between the various schools of law, Hanafi and Shafi'i mainly in India, and in theology and mystic traditions. Thinking about time and historical periods. Historians do not see time just as a passing of hours, days, or years as a clock or a calendar. Time also reflects changes in social and economic organization, in the persistence and transformation of ideas and beliefs. The study of time is made somewhat easier by dividing the past into large segments, periods that possess shared characteristics. In the middle of the 19th century, British historians divided the history of India into 3 periods: Hindu, Muslim, and British. This division was based on the idea that the religion of rulers was the only important historical change, and that there were no other significant developments in the economy, society, or culture. Such a division also ignored the rich diversity of the subcontinent. Few historians follow this periodization today. Most look to economic and social factors to characterize the major elements of different moments of the past. The histories you read last year included a wide range of early societies: hunter-gatherers, early farmers, people living in towns and villages, and early empires and kingdoms. The histories you will be studying this year are often described as medieval. You will find out more about the spread of peasant societies, the rise of regional and imperial state formations sometimes at the cost of pastoral and forest people, the development of Hinduism and Islam as major religions, and the arrival of European trading companies. These 1,000 years of Indian history witnessed considerable change. After all, the 16th and 18th centuries were quite different from the 8th or the 11th. Therefore, describing the entire period as one historical unit is not without its problems. Moreover, the medieval period is often contrasted with the modern period. Modernity carries with it a sense of material progress and intellectual advancement. This seems to suggest that the medieval period was lacking in any change whatsoever. But of course we know this was not the case. During these 1,000 years the societies of the subcontinent were transformed often, and economies in several regions reached a level of prosperity that attracted the interest of European trading companies. As you read this book, look out for signs of change and the historical processes at work. Also, whenever you can, try and compare what you read in this book with what you read last year. Look out for changes and continuities wherever you can, and look at the world around you to see what else has changed or remained the same. Imagine you are a historian. Choose one of the themes mentioned in this chapter, such as economic, social, or political history, and discuss why you think it would be interesting to find out the history of that theme. The value of paper. Compare the following. In the middle of the 13th century, a scholar wanted to copy a book. He did not have enough paper. So he washed the writing off a manuscript he did not want, dried the paper and used it. A century later, if you bought some food in the market, you could be lucky and have the shopkeeper wrap it for you in some paper. When was paper more expensive and easily available? In the 13th or the 14th century? Language and region. In 1318 the poet Amir Khusrau noted that there was a different language in every region of this land: Sindhi, Lahori, Kashmiri, Dvarsamudri, in southern Karnataka, Telangana, in Andhra Pradesh, Gujari, in Gujarat, Mabari, in Tamil Nadu, Gari, in Bengal, Awadhi, in eastern Uttar Pradesh, and Hindawi, in the area around Delhi. Amir Khusrau went on to explain that in contrast to these languages there was Sanskrit, which did not belong to any region. It was an old language and common people do not know it, only the Brahmanas do. Make a list of the languages mentioned by Amir Khusrau. Prepare another list of the names of languages spoken today in the regions he mentioned, underline names that are similar and circle those that are different. 2. New kings in kingdoms. Many new dynasties emerged after the 7th century. Map 1 shows the major ruling dynasties in different parts of the subcontinent between the 7th and 12th centuries. The emergence of new dynasties. By the 7th century there were big landlords or warrior chiefs in different regions of the subcontinent. Existing kings often acknowledged them as their subordinates or samantas. They were expected to bring gifts for their kings or overlords, be present at their courts and provide them with military support. As samantas gained power and wealth, they declared themselves to be Mahasamanta, Mahamandaleshvara, the great lord of a circle or region, and so on. Sometimes they asserted their independence from their overlords. One such instance was that of the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan. Initially they were subordinate to the Chalukyas of Karnataka. In the mid-8th century, Dantadurga, a Rashtrakuta chief, overthrew his Chalukya overlord and performed a ritual called Hiranyagarbha, literally, the golden womb. When this ritual was performed with the help of Brahmanas, it was thought to lead to the rebirth of the sacrificer as a Kshatriya, even if he was not one by birth. In other cases, men from enterprising families used their military skills to carve out kingdoms. For instance, the Kadamba Mayura Sharman and the Gurjara Pratihara Hari Chandra were Brahmanas who gave up their traditional professions and took to arms, successfully establishing kingdoms in Karnataka and Rajasthan respectively. Administration in the kingdoms. Many of these new kings adopted high-sounding titles such as Maharajadhiraja, Great King, Overlord of Kings, Tribhuvanachakravartin, Lord of the Three Worlds, and so on. However, in spite of such claims, they often shared power with their samantas as well as with associations of peasants, traders, and brahmanas. In each of these states, resources were obtained from the producers, that is, peasants, cattle keepers, artisans, who were often persuaded or compelled to surrender part of what they produced. Sometimes these were claimed as rent due to a lord who asserted that he owned the land. Revenue was also collected from traders. These resources were used to finance the king's establishment, as well as for the construction of temples and forts. They were also used to fight wars, which were in turn expected to lead to the acquisition of wealth in the form of plunder, and access to land as well as trade routes. The functionaries for collecting revenue were generally recruited from influential families, and positions were often hereditary. This was true about the army as well. In many cases, close relatives of the king held these positions. Prashastas and land grants. Prashastas contain details that may not be literally true. But they tell us how rulers wanted to depict themselves as valiant, victorious warriors, for example. These were composed by learned Brahmanas, who occasionally helped in the administration. Kings often rewarded Brahmanas by grants of land. These were recorded on copper plates, which were given to those who received the land. Unusual for the 12th century was a long Sanskrit poem containing the history of kings who ruled over Kashmir. It was composed by an author named Kalhana. He used a variety of sources, including inscriptions, documents, eyewitness accounts, and earlier histories, to write his account. Unlike the writers of Prashastas, he was often critical about rulers and their policies. Warfare for wealth. You may have noticed that each of these ruling dynasties was based in a specific region. At the same time, they tried to control other areas. One particularly prized area was the city of Kanauj in the Ganga Valley. For centuries, rulers belonging to the Gurjara Pratihara, Rashtrakuta, and Pala dynasties fought for control over Kanauj. Because there were three parties in this long-drawn conflict, historians often describe it as the tripartite struggle. As we will see, rulers also tried to demonstrate their power and resources by building large temples. So, when they attacked one another's kingdoms, they often chose to target temples, which were sometimes extremely rich. You will read more about this in Chapter 5. One of the best known of such rulers is Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, Afghanistan. He ruled from 997 to 1030, and extended control over parts of Central Asia, Iran, and the northwestern part of the subcontinent. He raided the subcontinent almost every year. His targets were wealthy temples, including that of Somnath, Gujarat. Much of the wealth Mahmud carried away was used to create a splendid capital city at Ghazni. He was interested in finding out more about the people he conquered, and entrusted a scholar named al-Biruni to write an account of the subcontinent. This Arabic work, known as the Kitab al-Hind, remains an important source for historians. He consulted Sanskrit scholars to prepare this account. Other kings who engaged in warfare include the Chahmanas, later known as the Chauhans, who ruled over the region around Delhi and Ajmer. They attempted to expand their control to the west and the east, where they were opposed by the Chalukyas of Gujarat and the Gahedevalas of western Uttar Pradesh. The best-known Chahmana ruler was Prithviraj III, 1168 to 1192, who defeated an Afghan ruler named Sultan Muhammad Ghori in 1191, but lost to him the very next year, in 1192. From Murayur to Tanjavur. How did the Cholas rise to power? A minor chiefly family known as the Muttarayar held power in the Kaveri Delta. They were subordinate to the Pallava kings of Kanchipuram. Vijayalaya, who belonged to the ancient chiefly family of the Cholas from Murayur, captured the delta from the Muttarayar in the middle of the 9th century. He built the town of Tanjavur and a temple for goddess Nishamhashadani there. The successors of Vijayalaya conquered neighbouring regions and the kingdom grew in size and power. The Pandyan and the Pallava territories to the south and north were made part of this kingdom. Rajaraja I, considered the most powerful Chola ruler, became king in 985 and expanded control over most of these areas. He also reorganized the administration of the empire. Rajaraja's son Rajendra I continued his policies and even raided the Ganga Valley, Sri Lanka, and countries of Southeast Asia, developing a navy for these expeditions. Splendid temples and bronze sculpture. The big temples of Tanjavur and Gangaikondakolappuram, built by Rajaraja and Rajendra, are architectural and sculptural marvels. Chola temples often became the nuclei of settlements which grew around them. These were centers of craft production. Temples were also endowed with land by rulers as well as by others. The produce of this land went to maintain all the specialists who worked at the temple and very often lived near it: priests, garland makers, cooks, sweepers, musicians, dancers, etc. In other words, temples were not only places of worship, they were the hub of economic, social, and cultural life as well. Amongst the crafts associated with temples, the making of bronze images was the most distinctive. Chola bronze images are considered amongst the finest in the world. While most images were of deities, sometimes images were made of devotees as well. Agriculture and irrigation. Many of the achievements of the Cholas were made possible through new developments in agriculture. Look at map 2 again. Notice that the river Kaveri branches off into several small channels before emptying into the Bay of Bengal. These channels overflow frequently, depositing fertile soil on their banks. Water from the channels also provides the necessary moisture for agriculture, particularly the cultivation of rice. Although agriculture had developed earlier in other parts of Tamil Nadu, it was only from the 5th or 6th century that this area was opened up for large-scale cultivation. Forests had to be cleared in some regions, land had to be leveled in other areas. In the Delta region, embankments had to be built to prevent flooding and canals had to be constructed to carry water to the fields. In many areas 2 crops were grown in a year. In many cases it was necessary to water crops artificially. A variety of methods were used for irrigation. In some areas wells were dug. In other places huge tanks were constructed to collect rainwater. Remember that irrigation works require planning, organizing labor and resources, maintaining these works and deciding on how water is to be shared. Most of the new rulers, as well as people living in villages, took an active interest in these activities. The administration of the empire. How was the administration organized? Settlements of peasants, known as became prosperous with the spread of irrigation agriculture. Groups of such villages formed larger units called nadu. The village council and the nadu had several administrative functions including dispensing justice and collecting taxes. Rich peasants of the Velila caste exercised considerable control over the affairs of the nadu under the supervision of the central Chola government. The Chola kings gave some rich landowners titles like Muvandavilan, a villain or peasant serving 3 kings, Yar, chief, etc. as markers of respect, and entrusted them with important offices of the state at the center. We have seen that Brahmanas often received land grants or Brahmadaya. As a result, a large number of Brahmana settlements emerged in the Kaveri Valley as in other parts of South India. Each Brahmadaya was looked after by an assembly or sabha of prominent Brahmana landholders. These assemblies worked very efficiently. Their decisions were recorded in detail in inscriptions, often on the stone walls of temples. Associations of traders known as Nagarams also occasionally performed administrative functions in towns. Inscriptions from Uttaramarur in Chengalpat district, Tamil Nadu, provide details of the way in which the Sabha was organized. The Sabha had separate committees to look after irrigation works, gardens, temples, etc. Names of those eligible to be members of these committees were written on small tickets of palm leaf and kept in an earthenware pot, from which a young boy was asked to pick the tickets, one by one for each committee. Inscriptions and texts. The working of a Sabha according to the Uttaramarur inscription. All those who wish to become members of the Sabha should be owners of land from which land revenue is collected. They should have their own homes. They should be between 35 and 70 years of age. They should have knowledge of the Vedas. They should be well versed in administrative matters and honest. If anyone has been a member of any committee in the last 3 years, he cannot become a member of another committee. Anyone who has not submitted his accounts, as well as those of his relatives, cannot contest the elections. While inscriptions tell us about kings and powerful men, here is an excerpt from the Periyapuranam, a 12th century Tamil work, which informs us about the lives of ordinary men and women. On the outskirts of Adanur was a small hamlet of Pulayas, a name used for a social group considered outcasts by Brahmanas and Velilas, studded with small huts under old thatches and inhabited by agrarian laborers engaged in menial occupations. In the thresholds of the huts covered with strips of leather, little chickens moved about in groups. Dark children who wore bracelets of black iron were prancing about, carrying little puppies. In the shade of the Maridu, Arjuna, trees, a female laborer put her baby to sleep on a sheet of leather. There were mango trees from whose branches drums were hanging, and under the coconut palms, in little hollows on the ground, tiny-headed bitches lay after whelping. The red-crested cocks crowed before dawn calling the brawny Pulayar, plural, to their day's work, and by day, under the shade of the kanji tree spread the voice of the wavy-haired Pulaya women singing as they were husking paddy. China under the Tang dynasty. In China, an empire was established under the Tang dynasty, which remained in power for about 300 years, from the 7th to the 10th centuries. Its capital, Xi'an, was one of the largest cities in the world, visited by Turks, Iranians, Indians, Japanese, and Koreans. The Tang Empire was administered by a bureaucracy recruited through an examination, which was open to all who wished to appear for it. This system of selecting officials remained in place, with some changes, till 1911. In what ways was this system different from those prevalent in the Indian subcontinent? Imagine you are present in an election for a Sabha. Describe what you see and hear. 400 taxes. The inscriptions of the Cholas who ruled in Tamil Nadu refer to more than 400 terms for different kinds of taxes. The most frequently mentioned tax is Veti, taken not in cash but in the form of forced labor and kadamai, or land revenue. There were also taxes on thatching the house, the use of a ladder to climb palm trees, a cess on succession to family property, etc. The achievements of Agabhata. Many rulers described their achievements in Prashastis. You read about the Prashasti of the Gupta ruler Samudragupta last year. One Prashasti, written in Sanskrit and found in Gwalior, Madhya Pradesh, describes the exploits of Nagabhata, a Pratihara king, as follows. The kings of Andhra, Sandhava, Sindh, Vidarbha, part of Maharashtra, and Kalinga, part of Orissa, fell before him even as he was a prince. He won a victory over Chakrayudha, the ruler of Kanauj. He defeated the king of Vanga, part of Bengal, Anarta, part of Gujarat, Malava, part of Madhya Pradesh, Kirita, forest peoples, Turushka, Turks, Vatsa, Matsya, both kingdoms in North India. What was given with the land? This is part of the Tamil section of a land grant given by the Cholas. We have demarcated the boundaries of the land by making earthen embankments, as well as by planting thorny bushes. This is what the land contains: fruit-bearing trees, water, land, gardens and orchards, trees, wells, open spaces, pasture land, a village, anthills, platforms, canals, ditches, rivers, silt-laden land, tanks, granaries, fish ponds, beehives, and deep lakes. He who receives the land can collect taxes from it. He can collect the taxes imposed by judicial officers as fines, the tax on betel leaves, that on woven cloth, as well as on vehicles. He can build large rooms, with upper stories made of baked bricks. He can get large and small wells dug. He can plant trees and thorny bushes. If necessary, he can get canals constructed for irrigation. He should ensure that water is not wasted, and that embankments are built. Types of land. Chola inscriptions mention several categories of land. Velanvagai. Land of non-Brahmana peasant proprietors. Brahmadaya. Land gifted to Brahmanas. Shalabhaga. Land for the maintenance of a school. Devadana, Tirunamadakani, land gifted to temples. Palachchandam. Land donated to Jaina institutions. 3. The Delhi Sultans. In Chapter 2 we saw that regions like the Kaveri Delta became the center of large kingdoms. Did you notice that there was no mention of a kingdom with Delhi as its capital? That was because Delhi became an important city only in the 12th century. Take a look at Table 1. Delhi first became the capital of a kingdom under the Tomara Rajputs, who were defeated in the middle of the 12th century by the Chauhans, also referred to as Chahamanas, of Ajmer. It was under the Tomaras and Chauhans that Delhi became an important commercial center. Many rich Jaina merchants lived in the city and constructed several temples. Coins minted here, called Dilawal, had a wide circulation. The transformation of Delhi into a capital that controlled vast areas of the subcontinent started with the foundation of the Delhi Sultanate in the beginning of the 13th century. Take a look at Table 1 again and identify the 5 dynasties that together made the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultans built many cities in the area that we now know as Delhi. Look at Map 1 and locate Delhi Kuna, Siri, and Jahanpana. The rulers of Delhi. Table 1. Rajput dynasties. Tomaras. Early 12th century to 1165. Anangapala. 1130 to 1145. Chauhans. 1165 to 1192. Prithviraj Chauhan. 1175 to 1192. Early Turkish rulers 1206 to 1290. Kutbuddin Aybuk. 1206 to 1210. Shams-ud-din Iltutmish. 1210 to 1236. Rachiya. 1236 to 1240. Gayasuddin Balban 1266 to 1287. Jalaluddin Khalji 1290 to 1296. Alauddin Khalji 1296 to 1316. Tughlaq Dysty 1320 to 1414. Gayasuddin Tughlaq 1320 to 1324. Muhammad Tughlaq 1324 to 1351. Firoz Shah Tughlaq 1351 to 1388. Khalji Dysty 1290 1320. Sayyid Dysty 1414 to 1451. Isra Khan 1414 to 1421. Lodi Dysty 1451 to 1526. Balo Lodi 1451 to 1489. Finding out about the Delhi Sultans. Although inscriptions, coins and architecture provide a lot of information, especially valuable are histories, Tariq, singular, /Tawarik, plural, written in Persian, the language of administration under the Delhi Sultans. The authors of Tawarik were learned men, secretaries, administrators, poets, and courtiers, who both recounted events and advised rulers on governance, emphasizing the importance of just rule. Keep the following additional details in mind. 1. The authors of Tawarik lived in cities, mainly Delhi, and hardly ever in villages. 2. They often wrote their histories for sultans in the hope of rich rewards. 3. These authors advised rulers on the need to preserve an ideal social order based on birthright and gender distinctions. Their ideas were not shared by everybody. In 1236 Sultan Iltutmish's daughter, Ruqayyah, became sultan. The chronicler of the age, Minhaj Siraj, recognized that she was more able and qualified than all her brothers. But he was not comfortable at having a queen as ruler. Nor were the nobles happy at her attempts to rule independently. She was removed from the throne in 1240. What Minhaj Siraj thought about Ruqayyah? Minhaj Siraj thought that the queen's rule went against the ideal social order created by God, in which women were supposed to be subordinate to men. He therefore asked, in the register of God's creation, since her account did not fall under the column of men, how did she gain from all of her excellent qualities? On her inscriptions and coins Ruqayyah mentioned that she was the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish. This was in contrast to the Queen Rudramadevi, 1262 to 1289, of the Kakatiya dynasty of Warangal, part of modern Andhra Pradesh. Rudramadevi changed her name on her inscriptions and pretended she was a man. Another queen, Dida, ruled in Kashmir, 980 to 1003. Her title is interesting. It comes from Didi or elder sister, an obviously affectionate term given to a loved ruler by her subjects. In the early 13th century the control of the Delhi sultans rarely went beyond heavily fortified towns occupied by garrisons. The sultans seldom controlled the hinterland of the cities and were therefore dependent upon trade, tribute, or plunder for supplies. Controlling garrison towns in distant Bengal and Sindh from Delhi was extremely difficult. Rebellion, war, even bad weather could snap fragile communication routes. The state was also challenged by Mongol invasions from Afghanistan and by governors who rebelled at any sign of the Sultan's weakness. The Sultanate barely survived these challenges. Its expansion occurred during the reigns of Gayasuddin Balban, Alauddin Khalji, and Muhammad Tughlaq. The first set of campaigns along the internal frontier of the Sultanate aimed at consolidating the hinterlands of the garrison towns. During these campaigns forests were cleared in the Ganga Yamuna Dub and hunter-gatherers and pastoralists expelled from their habitat. These lands were given to peasants and agriculture was encouraged. New fortresses and towns were established to protect trade routes and to promote regional trade. The second expansion occurred along the external frontier of the Sultanate. Military expeditions into southern India started during the reign of Alauddin Khalji and culminated with Muhammad Tughlaq. In their campaigns, Sultanate armies captured elephants, horses, and slaves and carried away precious metals. By the end of Muhammad Tughlaq's reign, 150 years after somewhat humble beginnings, the armies of the Delhi Sultanate had marched across a large part of the subcontinent. They had defeated rival armies and seized cities. The Sultanate collected taxes from the peasantry and dispensed justice in its realm. But how complete and effective was its control over such a vast territory? The masjid. A mosque is called a masjid in Arabic, literally a place where a Muslim prostrates in reverence to Allah. In a congregational mosque, Masjid-i-Jami or Jama Masjid, Muslims read their prayers, namaz, together. Members of the congregation choose the most respected, learned male as their leader, imam, for the rituals of prayer. He also delivers the sermon, khutbah, during the Friday prayer. During prayer, Muslims stand facing Mecca. In India this is to the west. This is called the Qiblat. The Delhi Sultans built several mosques in cities all over the subcontinent. These demonstrated their claims to be protectors of Islam and Muslims. Mosques also helped to create the sense of a community of believers who shared a belief system and a code of conduct. It was necessary to reinforce this idea of a community because Muslims came from a variety of backgrounds. A closer look, administration and consolidation under the Khaljis and Tughlaqs. The consolidation of a kingdom as vast as the Delhi Sultanate needed reliable governors and administrators. Rather than appointing aristocrats and landed chieftains as governors, the early Delhi Sultans, especially Iltutmish, favored their special slaves purchased for military service, called bandagan in Persian. They were carefully trained to man some of the most important political offices in the kingdom. Since they were totally dependent upon their master, the Sultan could trust and rely upon them. The Khaljis and Tughlaqs continued to use bandagan and also raised people of humble birth, who were often their clients, to high political positions. They were appointed as generals and governors. However, this also introduced an element of political instability. Slaves and clients were loyal to their masters and patrons, but not to their heirs. New sultans had their own servants. As a result, the accession of a new monarch often saw conflict between the old and the new nobility. The patronage of these humble people by the Delhi sultans also shocked many elites, and the authors of Persian Tawarikh criticized the Delhi sultans for appointing the low and baseborn to high offices. Like the earlier sultans, the Khalji and Tughlaq monarchs appointed military commanders as governors of territories of varying sizes. These lands were called Iqta and their holder was called Iqtidar or Mukti. The duty of the Muktis was to lead military campaigns and maintain law and order in their Iqtas. In exchange for their military services, the Muktis collected the revenues of their assignments as salary. They also paid their soldiers from these revenues. Control over Muktis was most effective if their office was not inheritable and if they were assigned Iqtas for a short period of time before being shifted. These harsh conditions of service were rigorously imposed during the reigns of Alauddin Khalji and Muhammad Tughlaq. Accountants were appointed by the state to check the amount of revenue collected by the Muktis. Care was taken that the Mukti collected only the taxes prescribed by the state and that he kept the required number of soldiers. As the Delhi sultans brought the hinterland of the cities under their control, they forced the landed chieftains, the Samanta aristocrats and rich landlords to accept their authority. Under Alauddin Khalji, the state brought the assessment and collection of land revenue under its own control. The rights of the local chieftains to levy taxes were cancelled and they were also forced to pay taxes. The sultan's administrators measured the land and kept careful accounts. Some of the old chieftains and landlords served the sultanate as revenue collectors and assessors. There were three types of taxes: 1. on cultivation called carriage and amounting to about 50% of the peasants produce, 2. on cattle and 3. on houses. It is important to remember that large parts of the subcontinent remained outside the control of the Delhi sultans. It was difficult to control distant provinces like Bengal from Delhi, and soon after annexing southern India, the entire region became independent. Even in the Gangetic Plain there were forested areas that Sultanate forces could not penetrate. Local chieftains established their rule in these regions.